Namibia, officially the Republic of Namibia, Afrikaans, Republiek van Namibië, is a country in southern Africa whose western border is the Atlantic Ocean. It shares land borders with Zambia and Angola to the north, Botswana to the east and South Africa to the south and east. Although it does not border Zimbabwe, a part of less than 200 meters of the Zambezi River separates it from the country. Namibia gained independence from South Africa on the 21st of March 1990, following the Namibian War of Independence. Its capital and largest city is Windhoek, and it is a member state of the United Nations, the Southern African Development Community, the African Union, and the Commonwealth of Nations. The dry lands of Namibia were inhabited since early times by the San, Damara, and Namakwa peoples. Since about the 14th century AD, immigrating Bantu arrived as part of the Bantu expansion. Since then the Bantu groups in total, known as the Ambo people, have dominated the population of the country and since the late 19th century, have constituted a large majority. In the late 19th century, during European colonization, the German Empire established rule over most of the territory as a protectorate in 1884. It began to develop infrastructure and farming, and maintained this German colony until 1915, when South African forces defeated its military. After the end of World War I, in 1920 the League of Nations mandated the country to the United Kingdom under administration by South Africa. It imposed its laws, including racial classifications and rules. From 1948, with the National Party elected to power, South Africa applied its apartheid policy also to what was known as Southwest Africa. In 1878, the British Cape Colony had annexed the port of Walvis Bay and the offshore Penguin Islands. These became an integral part of the new Union of South Africa at its creation in 1910. In the later 20th century, uprisings and demands for political representation by native African political activists seeking independence resulted in the UN assuming direct responsibility over the territory in 1966, but South Africa maintained de facto rule. In 1973 the UN recognized the Southwest Africa People's Organization as the official representative of the Namibian people. The party is dominated by the Ambo people, who are a large majority in the territory. Following continued guerrilla warfare, South Africa installed an interim administration in Namibia in 1985. Namibia obtained full independence from South Africa in 1990. The Walvis Bay and the Penguin Islands remained under South African control until 1994. Namibia has a population of 2.1 million people and a stable multi-party parliamentary democracy. Agriculture, herding, tourism and the mining industry, including mining for gem diamonds, uranium, gold, silver, and base metals, form the basis of its economy. The large arid Namib Desert has resulted in Namibia being overall one of the least densely populated countries in the world. Namibia enjoys high political, economic and social stability. History. The name of the country is derived from the Namib Desert, considered to be the oldest desert in the world. Before its independence in 1990, the area was known first as German Southwest Africa, then as Southwest Africa, reflecting the colonial occupation by the Germans and the South Africans. Pre-colonial period. The dry lands of Namibia were inhabited since early times by San, Damara, Nama. From about the 14th century AD, immigrating Bantu arrived with the Bantu expansion from Central Africa. For the late 18th century onwards, all clans from the Cape Colony crossed the Orange River and moved into the area that today is southern Namibia. Their encounters with the nomadic Nama tribes were largely peaceful. The mission missionaries accompanying the Olam were well received by them. The right to use waterholes and grazing was granted against an annual payment. On the way further northwards, however, the Olam encountered clans of the Hero tribe at Windhoek, Gobabis, and Okahandja, who resisted their encroachment. The Nama-Hero War broke out in 1880, with hostilities ebbing only after Imperial Germany deployed troops to the contested places and cemented the status quo among the Nama, Olam, and Hero. The first Europeans to disembark and explore the region were the Portuguese navigators Diogo Cao in 1485 and Bartolomeu Diaz in 1486. But the Portuguese crown did not try to claim the area. Like most of interior sub-Saharan Africa, Namibia was not extensively explored by Europeans until the 19th century. At the time, traders and settlers came principally from Germany and Sweden. In the late 19th century, Dorsland trekkers crossed the area on the way from the Transvaal to Angola. Some of them settled in Namibia instead of continuing their journey. German-ruled Namibia became a German colony in 1884 under Otto von Bismarck to forestall British encroachment and was known as German Southwest Africa. However, the Palgrave mission by the British governor in Cape Town had determined that only the natural deep-water harbour of Walvis Bay was worth occupying, and this was annexed to the Cape Province of British South Africa. From 1904 to 1907, the Hero and the Namaqua took up arms against the Germans. In calculated punitive action by the German occupiers, what has been called the first genocide of the 20th century was committed, as government officials ordered extinction of the natives. In the Hero and Namaqua genocide, the Germans systematically killed 10,000 Nama and approximately 65,000 Hero. The survivors, when finally released from detention, were subjected to a policy of dispossession, deportation, forced labor, racial segregation, and discrimination in a system that in many ways anticipated the apartheid established by South Africa in 1948. Most Africans were confined to so-called native territories, which later under South African rule post-1949 were turned into homelands. Indeed, some historians have speculated that the German genocide in Namibia was a model used by Nazis in the Holocaust. The memory of genocide remains relevant to ethnic identity in independent Namibia and to relations with Germany. The German government formally apologized from the Namibian genocide in 2004. South African rule. South Africa occupied the colony in 1915 after defeating the German forces during World War I. It administered it from 1919 onward as a League of Nations mandate territory. Although the South African government wanted to annex Southwest Africa into its official territory, it never did so, but it administered the territory as its de facto fifth province. The white minority of Southwest Africa elected representatives to the whites-only Parliament of South Africa. They also elected their own local administration, the SWA Legislative Assembly. The South African government appointed the SWA administrator, who had extensive executive powers. Following the League's replacement by the United Nations in 1946, South Africa refused to surrender its earlier mandate. The UN intended that it be replaced by a United Nations trusteeship agreement, requiring closer international monitoring of the territory's administration and a definite schedule to achieve independence of Namibia. After the rise of the National Party in South Africa, it established apartheid in both areas. The Hero Chiefs Council submitted a number of petitions to the UN in the 1950s calling for it to grant Namibia independence, but was not successful. During the 1960s, as European powers such as France and the United Kingdom granted independence to some colonies and trust territories in Africa, Pressure mounted on South Africa to do so in Namibia. In 1966, the International Court of Justice dismissed a complaint brought by Ethiopia and Liberia against South Africa's continued presence in the territory, but the UN General Assembly subsequently revoked South Africa's mandate. South Africa continued to exercise de facto rule while SWAPO expanded its guerrilla efforts to end that. In 1971, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion, declaring South Africa's continued administration to be illegal. In response to the 1966 ruling by the International Court of Justice, Southwest Africa People's Organization Military Wing, People's Liberation Army of Namibia, a guerrilla group, began their armed struggle for independence. It was not until 1988 that South Africa agreed to end its occupation of Namibia in accordance with a UN peace plan for the entire region. Land issues. During the decades of German and South African occupation of Namibia, white commercial farmers, most of whom came as settlers from South Africa and represented 0.2% of the national population, came to own 74% of the arable land. Outside the central southern area of Namibia, which contained the main towns, industries, mines and best arable land, South Africa designated areas of the country as homelands for various tribes, including the mixed-race Bastards, who had occupied the Rehoboth district since the late 19th century. It was an attempt to establish the Bantustans, but most indigenous Namibian tribes did not cooperate. Southwest Africa was formally recognized as Namibia by the UN. The General Assembly changed the territory's name by Resolution 2372 of 12 June, 1968. In 1978, the UN Security Council passed UN Resolution 435, which laid out a plan for transition toward independence for Namibia. Attempts to persuade South Africa to agree to the plan's implementation were not successful until 1988. After years of warfare, the transition to independence finally started under a diplomatic agreement between South Africa, Angola and Cuba, with the USSR and the USA as observers. Under this, South Africa agreed to withdraw and demobilize its forces in Namibia. As a result, Cuba agreed to pull back its troops in southern Angola, who were sent to support the MPLA in its war for control of Angola against UNITA. Angola also resolved its civil war. A combined UN civilian and peacekeeping force called NTAG, led by Finnish diplomat Martti Ahtisaari, was deployed from April 1989 to March 1990 to monitor the peace process and elections, and to supervise military withdrawals. As NTAG began to deploy peacekeepers, military observers, police, and political workers, hostilities were briefly renewed on the day the transition process was supposed to begin. After a new round of negotiations, a second date was set, and the elections process began in earnest. After the return of more than 46,000 SWAPO exiles, Namibia's first one-person, one-vote elections for the Constitutional Assembly took place in November 1989. The official election slogan was "Free and Fair Elections." This was won by SWAPO, although it did not gain the two-thirds majority it had hoped for. The South African-backed Democratic Tunhal Alliance became the official opposition. The elections were peaceful and declared free and fair. The Namibian constitution, adopted in February 1990, incorporated protection for human rights, compensation for state expropriations of private property, and established an independent judiciary, legislature, and an executive presidency. The country officially became independent on the 21st of March 1990. Sam Nujoma was sworn in as the first president of Namibia at a ceremony attended by Nelson Mandela of South Africa and representatives from 147 countries, including 20 heads of state. Upon the end of apartheid in South Africa in 1994, the nation ceded Walvis Bay to Namibia. After independence. Since independence, Namibia has successfully completed the transition from white minority apartheid rule to parliamentary democracy. Multi-party democracy was introduced and has been maintained, with local, regional and national elections held regularly. Several registered political parties are active and represented in the National Assembly, although the SWAPO has won every election since independence. The transition from the 15-year rule of President Sam Nujoma to his successor Hifikepunye Pohamba in 2005 went smoothly. Since independence, the Namibian government has promoted a policy of national reconciliation. It issued an amnesty for those who had fought on either side during the Liberation War. The civil war in Angola spilled over and adversely affected Namibians living in the north of the country. In 1998, Namibia Defense Force troops were sent to the Democratic Republic of the Congo as part of a Southern African Development Community contingent. In 1999, the national government successfully quashed a secessionist attempt in the northeastern Caprivi Strip. The Caprivi conflict was initiated by the Caprivi Liberation Army, a rebel group led by Meshake Muyongo. It wanted the Caprivi Strip to secede in order to form its own society. Geography. At 825,615 square kilometers, Namibia is the world's 34th largest country. It lies mostly between latitudes 17 degrees and 29 degrees south, and longitudes 11 degrees and 26 degrees east. Being situated between the Namib and the Kalahari deserts, Namibia has the least rainfall of any country in sub-Saharan Africa. The Namibian landscape consists generally of 5 geographical areas, each with characteristic abiotic conditions and vegetation, with some variation within and overlap between them. The Central Plateau, the Namib Desert, the Great Escarpment, the Bushveld, and the Kalahari Desert. The Central Plateau runs from north to south, bordered by the Skeleton Coast to the northwest, the Namib Desert and its coastal plains to the southwest, the Orange River to the south, and the Kalahari Desert to the east. The Central Plateau is home to the highest point in Namibia at Konigstein elevation 2,606 meters. The Namib Desert is a broad expanse of hyper-arid gravel plains and dunes that stretches along Namibia's entire coastline. It varies between 100 and many hundreds of kilometers in width. Areas within the Namib include the Skeleton Coast and the Kyoko Veld in the north and the extensive Namib Sand Sea along the central coast. The Great Escarpment swiftly rises to over 2,000 meters. Average temperatures and temperature ranges increase further inland from the cold Atlantic waters, while the lingering coastal fogs slowly diminish. Although the area is rocky with poorly developed soils, it is significantly more productive than the Namib Desert. As summer winds are forced over the escarpment, moisture is extracted as precipitation. The Bushveld is found in northeastern Namibia along the Angolan border and in the Caprivi Strip. The area receives a significantly greater amount of precipitation than the rest of the country, averaging around 400 mm per year. The area is generally flat and the soils sandy, limiting their ability to retain water and support agriculture. The Kalahari Desert, an arid region that extends into South Africa and Botswana, is one of Namibia's well-known geographical features. The Kalahari, while popularly known as a desert, has a variety of localized environments, including some verdant and technically non-desert areas. The succulent karoo is home to over 5,000 species of plants, nearly half of them endemic. Approximately 10% of the world's succulents are found in the karoo. The reason behind this high productivity and endemism may be the relatively stable nature of precipitation. Namibia's coastal desert is one of the oldest deserts in the world. Its sand dunes, created by the strong onshore winds, are the highest in the world. Because of the location of the shoreline, at the point where the Atlantic's cold water reaches Africa's hot climate, often extremely dense fog forms along the coast. Near the coast there are areas where the dunes are vegetated with hammocks. Namibia has rich coastal and marine resources that remain largely unexplored. Climate: Namibia extends from 17 degrees south to 25 degrees south. Climatically, the range of the subtropical high-pressure belt. Its overall climate description is arid, descending from the subhumid through semi-arid between 300 and 500 mm and arid from 150 to 300 mm to the hyper-arid coastal plain with less than a 100 mm mean. Temperature maxima are limited by the overall elevation of the entire region. Only in the far south Wombat, for instance, a mid-40 degrees Celsius maxima recorded. Typically the subtropical high-pressure belt, with frequent clear skies, provides more than 300 days of sunshine per year. It is situated at the southern edge of the tropics. The Tropic of Capricorn cuts the country about in half. The winter is generally dry. Both rainy seasons occur in summer, the small rainy season between September and November, the big one between February and April. Humidity is low, and average rainfall varies from almost zero in the coastal desert to more than 600 mm in the Caprivi Strip. Rainfall is highly variable, and droughts are common. The last bad rainy season with rainfall far below the annual average occurred in summer 2006-07. Weather and climate in the coastal area are dominated by the cold, north-flowing Benguela current of the Atlantic Ocean, which accounts for very low precipitation, frequent dense fog, and overall lower temperatures than in the rest of the country. In winter, occasionally a condition known as bergwind or oozewere occurs, a hot dry wind blowing from the inland to the coast. As the area behind the coast is a desert, these winds can develop into sand storms, leaving sand deposits in the Atlantic Ocean that are visible on satellite images. The Central Plateau and Kalahari areas have wide diurnal temperature ranges of up to 30 degrees Celsius. A funga, the annual seasonal flooding of the northern parts of the country, often causes not only damage to infrastructure but loss of life. The rains that cause these floods originate in Angola, flow into Namibia's Kuvali Basin, and fill the oceanas there. The worst flood so far occurred in March 2011 and displaced 21,000 people. Water sources: Namibia is the driest country in sub-Saharan Africa and depends largely on groundwater, with an average rainfall of about 350 mm per annum. The highest rainfall occurs in the Caprivi in the northeast and decreases in a westerly and southwesterly direction to as little as 50 mm and less per annum at the coast. The only perennial rivers are found on the national borders with South Africa, Angola, Zambia, and the short border with Botswana in the Caprivi. In the interior of the country, surface water is available only in the summer months when rivers are in flood after exceptional rainfalls. Otherwise, surface water is restricted to a few large storage dams retaining and damming up these seasonal floods and the runoff, where people do not live near perennial rivers or make use of the storage dams. They are dependent on groundwater. Even isolated communities and those economic activities located far from good surface water sources, such as mining, agriculture, and tourism, can be supplied from groundwater over nearly 80% of the country. More than 100,000 boreholes have been drilled in Namibia over the past century. One-third of these boreholes have been drilled dry. Communal wildlife conservancies. Namibia is one of few countries in the world to specifically address conservation and protection of natural resources in its constitution. Article 95 states, "The state shall actively promote and maintain the welfare of the people by adopting international policies aimed at the following: maintenance of ecosystems, essential ecological processes, and biological diversity of Namibia, and utilization of living natural resources on a sustainable basis for the benefit of all Namibians, both present and future." In 1993, the newly formed government of Namibia received funding from the United States Agency for International Development through its Living in a Finite Environment project. The Ministry of Environment and Tourism, with the financial support from organizations such as USAID, Endangered Wildlife Trust (WWF), and Canadian Ambassadors Fund, together form a community-based natural resource management support structure. The main goal of this project is promote sustainable natural resource management by giving local communities rights to wildlife management and tourism. Politics and government. Namibia is a unitary semi-presidential representative democratic republic. The President of Namibia is elected to a 5-year term and is both the head of state and the head of government. However, while the President is both head of state and government, all members of the government are individually and collectively responsible to the legislature. The Constitution of Namibia guarantees the separation of powers. Executive power is exercised by the President and the government. Legislature. Namibia has a bicameral parliament with the National Assembly as lower house, and the National Council as the upper house. Judiciary. Namibia has a system of courts that interpret and apply the law in the name of the state. While the Constitution envisaged a multi-party system for Namibia's government, the SWAPO party has been dominant since independence in 1990. Foreign relations. Namibia follows a largely independent foreign policy, with persisting affiliations with states that aided the independence struggle, including Cuba. With a small army and a fragile economy, the Namibian government's principal foreign policy concern is developing strengthened ties within the Southern African region. A dynamic member of the Southern African Development Community, Namibia is a vocal advocate for greater regional integration. Namibia became the 160th member of the UN on the 23rd of April 1990. On its independence it became the 50th member of the Commonwealth of Nations. Military. Namibia does not have any enemies in the region but consistently spends more as a percentage of GDP on its military than all of its neighbors, except Angola. Military expenditure rose from 2.7% of GDP in 2000 to 3.7% in 2009, and the arrival of 12 Chengdu J-7 Air Guard jets in 2006 and 2008 made Namibia for a short time one of the top arms importers in sub-Saharan Africa. By 2015, military expenditure was estimated at between 4% and 5% of GDP. The Constitution of Namibia defined the role of the military as defending the territory and national interests. Namibia formed the Namibian Defense Force, comprising former enemies in a 23-year bush war, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia and Southwest African Territorial Force. The British formulated the plan for integrating these forces and began training the NDF, which consists of a small headquarters and 5 battalions. The United Nations Transitional Assistance Group's Kenyan Infantry Battalion remained in Namibia for 3 months after independence to help train the NDF and to stabilize the north. According to the Namibian Defense Ministry, enlistments of both men and women will number no more than 7,500. Administrative division. Namibia is divided into 14 regions and subdivided into 121 constituencies. The administrative division of Namibia is tabled by delimitation commissions and accepted or declined by the National Assembly. Since state foundation for delimitation commissions have delivered the work, the last one in 2013 under the chairmanship of Judge Alfred Sibolika. Regional councillors are directly elected through secret ballots by the inhabitants of the constituencies. Local authorities in Namibia can be in the form of municipalities, town councils or villages.